Folks are in a storm today. There's a lot of this sermon. Pastor Don talked to me like 10 days ago, and he asked me to prepare a sermon to step in for him this morning. He went to Tampa, and I sat down at my computer, and in 2 days' time, I got as far as the title. That was it. 2 days to come up with a title. And I prayed about this, and I said, Lord, there's no time. I'm on a short timeline here. What is the block? What is? And he took me back to a sermon in my history folder. This was a sermon that I preached 2 years ago in September. And the Lord took me back through that sermon, and he had me change some things, add some things, take some things out. And I asked the Lord, I said, well, what is this? Why is this being recycled? And he told me that there are still a lot of people today are in the eye of the storm. They're caught in the storms of life, and there's such fear and uncertainty right now going on, and that people don't know which way to go. And fear and uncertainty go hand in hand. When you're not, and most of the time when these storms pop up, they're sudden, and you're uncertain of, am I going to do this right, or Lord, what's going here? I'm scared to death that this ain't going to work out. And there's just so much fear and anxiety and craziness that comes in with these storms. So this is what the Lord is telling me this morning, is to reassure folks about the eye of the storm, and when life storms are beating us up. And so we're going to take a look at a few things to try to take care of that problem, try to boost us up a little, so to speak. Our text this morning, if you have your Bibles, or you can follow on the screen, or if you have an electronic Bible, you can. But it's going to come from the book of Matthew 14, and we're going to look at verses 22 through 32. Everybody ready? Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he sent the multitudes away. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now when evening came, he was alone there. But the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Now in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out for fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Be of good cheer, it is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, saying, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." So Jesus said, "Come." And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous and he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Save me, Lord." And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. So again, this morning we're going to take our faith for a little stroll along with Peter's faith. Now, it's very important to look back and see what led up to this event. So what we're going to do is we're just going to kind of back up a little bit and look at verses 19 through 21. And this is going to bring us up to this event. Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up into heaven and said a blessing. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of the broken pieces left over. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Now, I emphasize besides women and children because that doesn't give us the full count. So what I've done was I did some very conservative math just to get kind of average to figure something out here real quick. So I took the original 5,000 count, the 5,000 men, and I figured that 65% of them had wives with them. Now, 65% of 5,000 is 3,250. And of those 3,250 women, I conservatively said, okay, they each had 2 children with them. So that's another 6,500. So what we have now is the 5,000 men, the 3,250 women, and the 6,500 children. So that's roughly 14, well, that's not roughly, it is 14,750 people. So that many people were fed from 5 loaves and 2 fish. Now, that's not in the scripture. Again, that's just a conservative math figure from going on that they weren't counted in the original head count. See, Jim Kapoor, he doesn't let me call ahead for head counts anymore either because I always forget the other 12,000 or so. Okay, so again, like I said, roughly 14,750 people were fed. And so you talk about a heavy-duty, supersized miracle. Now, remember this number, okay, because the 14,750 will come into play a little later down the road. The Apostle John, in chapter 6 of the book of John, he writes about this event also. But he adds that the effect of this miracle was so great on the huge crowd that they were preparing to take Jesus by force and to make him a king. Now Jesus, knowing of this plan that the people had come up with, he made his disciples get into the boat. He made them get into the boat. Why would Jesus have to make the disciples get into the boat? Well, one of the reasons I came up with, what I was thinking, is, again, where John was talking about how the crowds would, I could see them getting into a frenzy. Okay, they're all getting all excited. They want to make Jesus their king. They just seen this 14,000 plus people get fed. Okay, so there's a frenzy going on. And Jesus had to make the disciples get into the boat because really the disciples were getting into a frenzy also. They were starting to get worked up. And Jesus knew that the disciples wanted to stay with the crowds and to stay with the leftovers practically, basically. And so Jesus knew that what kind of influence the crowds would have on the disciples. So he had to make the disciples get into the boat to get them away from the crowds more than anything else. And so Jesus has the disciples at this time now. They're starting to set sail in this boat. And he turns his attention now to this very large crowd. Knowing of their plans, he dismisses the crowds, and then he gets away as privately as possible, going up onto the mountain to be alone, where he prays there all night. And so our story today starts out as just another familiar short boat trip for the disciples. Now the disciples, most of them were commercial fishermen, and they had sailed this stretch of waters many different times, okay? So it wasn't a strange stretch of water to them. And the night was a great night for sailing. The skies were clear and full of stars. But then, out of nowhere, this sudden storm blows in. Brother Mike would be able to go along with this, he'll know what I'm talking about. When you're out, there's times when you're out on a boat in the Gulf of Mexico during the summer, and then all of a sudden, sudden storms. You know exactly what I'm talking about if you've been out on a boat. How sudden storms will pop up when you're out in the middle of the Gulf. You know, you can be sitting there, and from my experience, you look out and like 100 miles away, see this little tiny black speck of cloud. You say, I got more time, I'm going to cast a few more times. Then what happens, Mike? The seas just pick up and toss you around like a rag doll. And so, now here we have the disciples, and they're in this boat, and they're in the middle of this crazy storm, taking a short trip, which is quickly turning into an epic journey. Now it seems like epic journeys always start from short trips, if you ever noticed. Like now there was Moses, and the walk around the 40 years in the desert. I read that trip was supposed to take, I think, a month, if that. It was a very short trip. But it ended up being an epic 40-year trip. And then you have Jonah. He started out on a luxury tour, not a short trip, and he ended up in the belly of the great fish. And then there's Gilligan. And the SS Minnow's 3-hour tour. I want to run off a trail real quick. This has really nothing to do with the sermon, but I think this is a question that's going to go down in history. Why did they have so much clothes for a 3-hour boat trip?
Good question.
Okay, that was my rabbit trail, as Pastor Don calls them. Okay, so here again we have the disciples, and they're in this boat, and the storm winds are picking up, and they're starting to get crazy out there. And for the disciples, it was actually like deja vu, okay, because they remembered another time when a storm in the same stretch of water threatened to swamp their boat. We're not going to turn back, but if you turn back to chapter 8, it tells the story of how Jesus got into a boat with the disciples when a storm blew in, and the boat was being battered by the winds and the waves, and the disciples, they were scared to death. And what was Jesus doing? He was sleeping. He's back there in the boat sleeping. And the disciples, they woke him up and they said, "Save us, Lord. We are perishing." I often wondered, when I read that a couple times, I often wondered, did the disciples get together at first and debate, no, you wake him up. You do it. So anyways, they wake Jesus up. And Jesus probably gets up, the waves and stuff, and he's probably just, Jesus, like, man, what are you guys afraid of? Why are you afraid? And so now we see the disciples are caught in another storm, fearing for their lives, and I'm sure that the disciples are asking a question that we ourselves ask often when we are caught in sudden storms and afraid. Where is Jesus during all of this? Okay, so picture this. Let's get in our mind machines and go back. You're on the water. You're in a little boat. A storm is raging with gale force winds. Now, according to the National Hurricane Center, the term gale is simply used to refer to winds of tropical force between 38 and 72 miles an hour. And if you lived in Florida any length of time for more than 1 year, you're familiar with tropical storms. Okay, so again, let's get into this little boat with the disciples. And there's these tropical force winds, and they're whipping and howling around them, and the waves are crashing against the boat, threatening to swamp them. And the disciples have turned the boat into the bow into the wind, and they're struggling with these oars. They have pulled down the main sails to keep the sail from being torn to shreds. Needless to say that these disciples are in some serious trouble out there. Now, meanwhile, back at the mountain, Jesus has just finished praying. And he comes down from the mountain, and he knows that the disciples are in trouble. So according to verse 25, in the fourth watch of the night, he went to them walking on the water. Now, the first time I read this a couple years ago, the fourth watch, it wasn't ringing with me like the fourth watch. Well, this is what the fourth watch is. The Romans divided the night into military watches instead of hours, with each watch representing the period of time the guards remained on duty. So the 4 watches were divided into 3-hour intervals starting at 6 p.m. So the first watch would be from 6 to 9 p.m., the second 9 to 12, the third 12 to 3, and the fourth 3 to 6. If you did any time in the military, that's kind of close to fire watch. The only problem is when you do fire watch, the next guy doesn't want to wake up. Right, Mike? Okay, so here it is very early in the morning, okay? And Jesus is walking out to them. When one of the people in the boat, they stopped, they looked up, and they're like, what in the world? I could just see them like rubbing their eyes in disbelief and saying to each other, do you see what I see? Is there someone walking on the water? Someone else would answer, nah, it can't be. They have to be in a boat. But I don't see a boat. Suddenly one of the 12 shouts out, it's a ghost!
Okay.
You awake now?
Yep.
Talk about freaking out, huh? A ghost seems to have been the consensus of the 12. Now, I can tell you from personal experience, from working at a graveyard shift as a security guard at a marina. Okay. When it's pitch black out there and the moon is covered up, the stars and the clouds are all out, you can't see nothing out there. You can look out and you can't even tell where the water and the clouds meet. It's just that black. Pitch black. You can't see nothing. But you can see things. Palm fronds are the one that scares you to death, and black nights like that. I can just imagine the 12 disciples are probably thinking, great, what's next? First this crazy storm, and now a ghost walking on the water. Now, some folks would have mocked the disciples at this point for accepting the popular notion of a ghost. But there's a bigger offense here, and that is they still underestimate Jesus' power. Just a few hours earlier, they had just witnessed Jesus feeding over 5,000 with the 5 loaves and 2 fish. If you recall, we did the math, and the head count could have been up to 14,000 plus. And yet the disciples still don't fully grasp Jesus' identity. It still has not occurred to them that, hey, Jesus could know our dilemma and walk out on the water to us in the storm. So there was only one thing left to do, and they screamed in fear, it's a ghost. Being a close companion of Jesus will not eliminate moments of distress and fear. Here's a reality of life, that winds will often be pitted against us. It is in these times when we are up against these winds when life can become a desperate struggle. We struggle with ourselves. We struggle with ourselves when things don't go the way we think they should. We struggle with ourselves when stuff just seems to happen and we just don't understand why. We struggle with ourselves when we don't seem to be able to live up to our own self-imposed standards. And then there's circumstances. We struggle with our circumstances by questioning why this or why has that happened to me. And then there's the struggle with our temptations and our sorrows and our decisions. None of us can escape moments of distress. But here's the good news. We do not have to face those moments of distress alone. In their moments of distress, Jesus came to the disciples telling them to be of good cheer. Now the disciples again are probably sitting in this boat and they're thinking, be of good cheer? Oh no. Jerusalem, we have a problem. We have been battling this storm for hours, fighting for our very lives. We're cold and we're wet. And now out of nowhere, some dude is walking across the water telling us to cheer up. But when Jesus called out to his disciples to be of good cheer, he qualifies his statement by adding, "It is I. Do not be afraid." You see, by walking out on the water in a furious storm, Jesus is demonstrating that he is indeed the Lord over all creation. And so there is no need to be afraid, is there? When Jesus said, "It is I, do not be afraid," the fear issue seems now to be solved. Because once they recognize that their teacher is with them, there's no reason to fear anymore. And just as Jesus came to the disciples in their moment of distress, he will come to us in our moments of distress. And with the very same proclamation, do not be afraid, be of good cheer. It is I. Here's what Jesus, I believe, is saying. I can break it down, and this is what he's saying. It's just simple as this. Hey guys, it's me, and I've got everything under control. Well, Peter must have thought this, so he stood up, and he shouts out, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you." And I love the way Jesus answered. And Jesus answered him saying very simply, Come on, the water's good. Come on in. So Peter does just what Jesus says. Now, in the scriptures, it talks about, he got over the boat. It kind of sounds like he just jumped over and just took off running. I don't think it's like that. I believe that Peter put one foot on the water first, just to kind of test it. And then he puts another foot out there. And he starts walking towards Jesus. And what Pastor Jill and I have learned in baby steps. I don't think he's walking too fast right away. But he's walking. So you see, once Jesus gave him the command, walking on the water was just a matter of trust. And you can imagine what Peter was really thinking at that very moment. I mean, not only is he standing on the water, because now he's got to be excited. I'm standing on water. But now he's walking on the water. But he's just not walking, he's walking out to Jesus.
Praise God.
Now, personally, I believe that this is just when the old devil showed up. And he whispered into Peter's ear, "Hey, dummy, what are you doing? You can't walk on water. You're going to drown." Now, Peter, remember, he's a commercial fisherman. And he has a really healthy respect for the sea. And And that's when he suddenly realizes, hey, wait one doggone minute. People don't walk on water. And he begins to sink. See, Peter was walking on the water until he felt the wind and the waves around him, and he started to look at his situation rather than the God's power which is supporting him. Yet even in his moment of distress, Peter knew who to cry out to. You see, in his moments of failure, and I want to stress the word moments, because this would not be Peter's only failure. But in his moments of failure, he always reached his hands out to Jesus. And he always found a helping hand, not a pointing finger.
Amen.
When Jesus told Peter that he was of little faith, I believe that Jesus was not reprimanding Peter. Rather, he was acknowledging Peter had some faith. Remember when he said, "Why did you doubt?" I believe Jesus is saying, Peter, Peter, you were doing it. You were doing it. Why did you doubt? It's also important here to note that while Jesus is disappointed with Peter's small amount of faith, he is not disappointed with Peter. Peter has actually acted in greater faith than the other disciples. And so what Peter is doing, Peter's learning. Peter's faith is growing. See, faith cannot be worked up by formulas or emotions, but it grows through various tests as we continue to trust our Lord. And he continues to teach us. Faith grows out of a relationship with the person of Jesus Christ, and in no other way. One thing we have to admire about Peter is this. Every time he fell, he got up again. Perhaps it was such failure that brought Peter closer to his Lord. It's said that a saint is not a man who never fails. A saint is the one who gets up and goes every time he fails. Our faith may be less than Peter's if we have never even tried to step out in obedience to Jesus' commands or his direction for our own lives. There's a story about a Union Army officer. His name was Colonel Joshua Chamberlain. He was a college professor who joined the Union Army at the start of the Civil War, and he commanded the 20th Maine Infantry Regiment. The 20th was ordered to hold the ridge at Little Round Top, which is the smaller of two rocky hills south of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. On July 2nd, 1863, General Robert E. Lee ordered an attack on Union forces dug in just south of the town. General Lee's forces stormed the Union Army's left flank. The 20th Maine was just about out of ammunition, so Colonel Chamberlain ordered a bayonet charge down Little Round Top, fending off the Southern forces. Colonel Chamberlain's force at that time was down to 80 men, yet only armed with bayonets, they captured 400 heavily armed Southern soldiers. Colonel Chamberlain remarked about this later, saying, "I felt sorry for my men. Their leader had no real knowledge of warfare or tactics. I was only a stubborn man, and that was my great advantage in this fight. I had deep within me the inability to do nothing." Colonel Chamberlain's actions were key in the Union Army's victory at Gettysburg, and it was a turning point in the war. All because Colonel Chamberlain refused to give in and instead took extreme action. Colonel Chamberlain was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions. And so now when it comes to extreme situations, we can all count on being in one at some point in our lives. Colonel Chamberlain, it was facing off 400 armed men, being overwhelmed by them. And for Peter, in Peter's case, it was a storm he had no control over. You see, Jesus said, the Father makes his Son rise on the evil and the good. So what that means is this. You may not be in a storm right now. But trust me, whether you are a believer or not, storms will, at some point in time, come into each of our lives. Storms of unemployment, financial setbacks, marital and family conflicts, and yes, even death. Folks, Jesus never promised our lives would be rose gardens. Some of storms' lives are brought on by ourselves. In other words, if I smoke cigarettes and I end up with lung cancer, I can't say, God, why or how could you do this to me? You cheat on a spouse and your spouse divorces and leaves. You can't stand and say, God, why did you do this to me? You get fired from a job because you're always late and you do sloppy work. So as you can see, some storms are our own faults. Now Satan can and will cause some of our storms. The storm in Job 119, which killed Job's family, was credited to Satan. But, there are times when, however, we give the devil a room he didn't pay rent for. In other words, sometimes things just happen. I've had many friends who have died through no fault of their own from illnesses or freak accidents. In John chapter 9, the disciples asked Jesus a question about a blind man. And they asked, Lord, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sins or his parents' sin? And Jesus answered, saying, it was not because of his sins or his parents' sins. This happened so the power of God could be seen in him. You see, sometimes it's God who sends us into storms because there are times when it takes a storm for us to get out of our comfort zone and to do something. Now, meanwhile, back at the boat. Kind of sounds like Pastor Don's revelation. Remember that? How could you forget those 90-something weeks? So, meantime, back at the boat, you got to remember, the storm is still raging, okay? And it's beating the heck out of this boat. And Jesus is standing on the water just as Peter calls out, Lord, if it is you, command me to come. Now, when I read that, I'm saying that Peter is still not 100% convinced that it's Jesus. Even after Jesus has told them that it was him. So when Jesus told Peter to come on, Peter took a huge risk stepping over the side of the boat. Let me ask you this one question. Outside of going to Walmart on a Saturday afternoon, when was the last time that you took a risk when it comes to your faith? In other words, when was the last time that you got out of your comfy little boat and took a risk? If you're like me, when I was young in the faith, I was quick, man, to climb out of that boat and go outside the walls of this church and to pursue people with fire and a passion. But sadly, somewhere along the way, we have lost that passion for risk, and we started staying in the boat more often. There are some folks who say Peter really didn't take a risk. I say nay, nay. You didn't see any of the 11 other, you didn't see any of the other 11 getting on the boat. See, it's easy to play it safe, but it's not profitable. Peter wasn't the only one in the Bible, though, that took a risk. There was Abraham, Noah, David, and Mary, just to name a few. But you know, there was also Jesus. What if he did not want to take the risk of coming to earth after all? In our modern history, we have people such as Thomas Edison, Alexander Graham Bell, and Henry Ford, to name a few. Because they were willing to get out on the boat, the scope of human history was changed. You see, Peter did what no one had done before or since. He walked on the water. Now, I don't know how far he walked, and it really doesn't matter. What does matter is he walked on the water. Let me tell you, if I had my choice, I'd rather be a wet, believing Peter than a dry, doubting Thomas. Let me pose this thought to you. After Peter took his eyes off of Jesus and started to sink, and Jesus lifted him up, well, they had to get back to the boat somehow, didn't they? I believe, when I read that, I see Jesus and Peter walking hand in hand back to the boat. When my father went to be with the Lord when I was 16 years old, so that was 40 plus years ago. So most of my memories I have of him is when I was a little boy. One of the fondest memories I have with him is going downtown with them, downtown Miami. This was back in the late 60s. Got on the street, on the county bus, and we rode downtown. And you know, when you're a little fellow, downtown Miami is scary. There's a lot of stuff going on downtown Miami. A lot of movement, a lot of cars, a lot of people. At that time, you had people, different languages going on and different things. And it was just, again, for a little boy. But you know what? When Dad took my hand, and he held that hand, his hand always, in hindsight, I can see, but when I was a little boy, that hand was like a glove, man. It would wrap you around you. And as long as I held on to that hand, nothing in downtown Miami was going to hurt me. Nothing. Because my dad had his hand in my hand. Folks, this is what it's like when Jesus comes to us in our time of fear, in our time of storm, and takes us by the hand and walks us back to the boat. When Jesus got back into the boat, the winds immediately calmed down. And there's a great truth to that right there. The very presence of Jesus brought calm to the storm. And in moments of great distress in our lives, the presence of Jesus will not only bring calm, but peace as well. And not just any peace, His peace.
Amen.
A perfect peace. Throughout Scripture, the theme of God's power is continually offered as a comfort to the believers. We do not have to be anxious for anything because our Heavenly Father reigns over all. God is all powerful. God is all wise. God is all present. And He has promised to work all things together for His glory and our good. So we don't have to be worried or concerned about tomorrow because God is already there in tomorrow. Psalms 115:3 tells us this. Our God is in heaven. He does whatever He pleases. What this means is this. We can trust Him to have full assurance in the reality that He is still on His throne. And He is still in full control. Taking this viewpoint, though, I can tell you now, will not take away life's storms. But it will enable us to find joy and peace when we're in the middle of them. And so in closing, let me leave you with this. When the storm winds of life are howling all around you, and you're struggling with the oars, remember this one thought. It is not what is in your boat, but who is in your boat. So trust Him. And you may just find yourself walking on the water in the eye of the storm.
Hi, this is Pastor Don from Waters Edge Church here in Cape Coral, Florida. Thank you for stopping by our YouTube channel to listen in to our Sunday morning preaching services. If you want more information about us, I invite you to check out our webpage at mywatersedgechurch.com, or you can check our Facebook page. Just search for Waters Edge Church, Cape Coral, Florida. Or better yet, I would love to meet you in person. We gather every Sunday morning at 10:30 for a time of inspirational worship and biblically based preaching. We would love to meet you, and we've got a seat here reserved just for you. Hope to see you soon. God bless.